Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on visual behaviors and red flags, an overview of cortical visual impairment, and considerations for making an accurate diagnosis. My name is Dina Buck and I work at the Integrated Training Collaborative at the Partnership for People with Disabilities at Virginia Commonwealth University. I am so excited to have this opportunity for us all to learn together about a topic that's really of interest to me and was certainly of interest to many of you as you put this topic on your as a priority for a follow-up webinar for one we did earlier this year. I'm really excited to have my colleague Julie Durando here with me. She works with us at the Partnership for People with Disabilities right in our same department, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more about her work and her experience. I did want to let you know that Dawn Hendricks, who had planned to be with us today and has prepared the content for today's session, has had a death in her family, and so she is away and will not be able to join us. But I will be able to share that content with you in her place. I know that I won't do as good a job as Dawn would have done, but I will do my very best. And we will certainly share any questions that you have that I am not able to answer with her, and I know that she'll get that. She will be able to help us share that information with you. But we will carry forward. Anyway, I also want to thank the team from the Integrated Training Collaborative who are also helping us with today with making our webinar happen. Jeannie Schroeder, who is our amazing technology specialist and e-learning specialist who's helped to make all of the visuals work for today's session, including this amazing picture that's on your screen of this beautiful baby and the eye, which I just love. And then Dana Childress, who is also on the phone with us today to support our work with this webinar. I really appreciate their help. So anyway, without further ado, I think we will go ahead and get started with our webinar. If you did not have a chance to download the PowerPoint, I would encourage you to do that now just so you'll have that in front of you. Well, like I said, our planned presenters for today's session were Julie Durando and Dawn Hendricks. And so I'm going to let Julie tell you a little bit more about her work and her experience for today, and then we'll get started.
Hi, my name is Julie Durando, and I work here at the Partnership with Dina and also at the Virginia Project for Children and Young Adults with Deafblindness. And that is a federally funded through OSEP Technical Assistance and Dissemination grant. And if you want more information about that, you can go to the talk on Tuesday that my colleague VEIPD had presented back in March. And she talks about deafblindness, some services that we provide, and also identification for our annual child count that we just wrapped up. So thank you for all of you who helped participate in that. But today, I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about an overview of cortical visual impairment. This topic came up when I was in a meeting earlier this year with Dina, and we were talking about some of the challenges with identification of children with autism and cortical vision impairment, and we thought, well, maybe we should just share a little bit about this in a webinar. So keep in mind that this is a huge topic and an emerging field with lots of research and lots of different opinions that are still being kind of meshed out in the field of visual impairments. I imagine autism might have some of the similar disagreements. So know that we're going to do our very best to share with you some information and some considerations, but there's some leeway here because children are very complex, and there's not like a fine line of this is definitely CVI and this is definitely autism. And the purpose of this webinar is just to give you a little bit of an overview of some characteristics, but realize that it's not meant to fully prep someone to be a screener or identifier of either condition. So just keep that in mind, and hopefully the information will be helpful, and also we want to share a few strategies along the way so that you'll have some of those to lean on as well. Okay, but first we're going to start out with the poll. And if you weren't here when we gave the introduction, the polling can be found just underneath your name. You'll see a little box, and we'd like to know how much experience have you had with children who have visual impairment.
Yeah, so for those of you who weren't able to join us for the pre-session, if you just look over on the left-hand side of your, or at least on the left-hand side of my screen, there's a little box that says participants and then my name, and then underneath it are 4 little boxes, and the furthest one to the right has a little A under it. So if you just put your cursor right there, it will bring forward little boxes, and so you can pick the one that is the choice that you would like to select for right now for this poll.
And we realize some of you are in large groups, and you can maybe just decide amongst yourself how to answer in those large groups. But we're glad you're here and joining together and learning this information.
So we'll give you a minute to answer, and then Jeannie will be able to publish our answers, and we'll know the experience of our group. All right, looks like most people have had a chance to answer. Let's see what our results are, Jeannie.
All right, nice, a nice mix.
I like that.
All right. Well, we're going to start with just a quick mention of the visual system. A lot of us, when we think of visual impairments, might just think about the eye or the cataracts or the lenses. And the retina, but it's also very important to remember that there's the optic nerve and the brain that has a vital role in understanding what we see. And similarly, often the type of visual impairment that's most familiar is acuity loss, which some of us can get a nice feel for if we just take off our glasses or our contact lenses, and we can experience a little bit of an acuity loss that's correctable. Now we also know that some children have acuity losses that is not correctable, even with the best possible prescription lenses, they still have some acuity loss. So that is a different type of visual impairment than what we're going to focus on today with the cortical vision impairment. Okay, there's also field loss is another type of visual impairment. This one receives a little less attention and isn't as publicly known about. But it's also very important when observing characteristics in children and looking at the behaviors. Sometimes a child with field loss might have a peripheral loss, which is demonstrated in the left picture. And you can kind of simulate this yourself by kind of pretending to play telescope like a little child, like pretending to be a pirate, looking through, and you can kind of give yourself a field loss and block out the side visual information. And with that also, notice that the acuity is fine. The picture is still very clear what the child could see in the middle of that. It's just they're not seeing as much of that picture at one time. And on the other side, there's a different type of field loss, and the field loss can occur anywhere in the visual field. So this is more of a central field loss. And what's important to note with children with visual impairments with a field loss is their visual behaviors might look peculiar if you don't recognize it as a field loss. So for instance, the child that sees, like on the left side picture, might scan often and use a lot of visual scanning to see information in the room. They might turn their head more than average. And the picture on the right-hand side with the central loss, that child might use their side vision or look above or below the target to naturally compensate for where their best vision is. So the challenge there for adults is to realize that the child is actually accommodating his or her own vision, and we want to make sure we don't interfere with these accommodations or try to direct the child's eye gaze straight at something, because they're actually using the best vision they can, even though it might look like they're looking above or below what you're trying to show them, or above or below or to the side of what you're presenting, or your eye. So they might not make eye contact in the way that you would expect. Now, cortical visual impairment, often sometimes referred to with as cerebral visual impairment, is defined in the most recent publication, is a lovely book by Dutton and Luke, that is visual impairment due to damage or disorder of the visual pathways and centers in the brain, including pathways serving visual perception, cognition, and visual guidance of movement. And there's lots more information in that book, and it's very scientific and very technical and very thorough. So it's a wonderful resource. Another educational definition could be found at aph.org/CVI, which if you're unfamiliar with the American Printing House for the Blind, that is a website full of information that can be used and accessed very readily. So, why is this important? One of the most important reasons is that it's the leading cause or the most prevalent cause of visual conditions from birth to 3. You'll see here, according to the Babies Count, a national registry for children with visual impairment that's participated by many states in the U.S., they have it ranked as 23.6% of the children identified with visual loss under 3 is attributed to cortical visual impairment. So that's compared to the next highest rank is the retinopathy of prematurity, which is at 16.2%. So you can see that's a pretty significant difference. And also in some of the other research it's pointed out that often CVI can go undiagnosed, and that's just because it's difficult to diagnose, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. But some estimates of certain conditions such as cerebral palsy, there's range of between 20 and 60% of children with cerebral palsy are thought to have cortical visual impairment when they're tested by someone skilled in recognizing it. So it's one of those things to keep in mind and to watch for the behaviors, because the good news about cortical visual impairment is that children can improve the use of their vision, and they can regain or gain visual skills and visual functioning, especially when given good strategies at an early age. So that's really important that we notice these behaviors and make some modifications to their environment and to how we interact with them so that we can optimize what they are receiving visually. So we don't exactly have a simulation for cortical visual impairment, and it probably affects every child very differently anyways. However, just to give an idea of the fact that you might be able to see something but not visually process it, we have an image in this picture. And if you can look at this picture and find the image, raise your hand. And again, that is underneath in the participants box. Underneath your name is a little hand, third box over. And if you see this picture, and what we're going to do is I'm going to give you some easier pictures to help you see this. So I'm going to offer some strategies in just a minute. I'm going to let you struggle a little bit because I know you're tough. Okay, a few people are seeing it already. Way to go, Ira, my colleague who's seen this hundreds of times. I'm glad you got it. So I'll tell you, that picture was upside down, and now I've made it right side up. And let me see if this helps a few others. Continue to keep your hands up. So now those who already saw it, just invert that picture, and now it's right side up. Okay, I'm also going to let you know this is an animal, and the animal is smelling the ground. Let's see if a little context can help you visually focus on this. And if you're with the group, try not to say it out loud until others get a chance. Another strategy for supporting the visual processing is to use some color. So I'm going to outline this in color and see if that helps you make out the picture. So now you can see there's an animal, and it's got 4 legs, and it's sniffing the ground. Great, so more of you are starting to see it now. Excellent. So now, notice how you've learned to visually process this, and I'm going to remove the color. Well, actually, I'm going to keep the color and turn it upside down. So now you can see that very first picture that I showed you. And now here's that same picture with the color removed. And what I'm hoping is that you've learned to visually process this and that you're making sense that there's still a dog sniffing the ground in this picture that is now turned upside down. And one of the reasons for disorienting it is to also point out that sometimes we show children toys and objects and pictures and things like that at different orientations, and it does change the way we look at things, and they have to learn to realize that those things are turned upside down and that it's still the same dog whether it's facing upside down or right side up. Another resource that I wanted to share is a book called Cortical Visual Impairment, An Approach to Assessment and Intervention. This was written by Christine Roman Lansey, and it's published in 2007. My understanding is a new updated version of this book is due out before too much longer. And this book has a nice functional visual assessment that is in there, and it consists of reviewing medical diagnoses, parent interviews, and observing the child for 10 characteristics. So some of the characteristics, we're going to cover some of the characteristics that they refer to in this book, but since we have a limited amount of time and lots of information to cover, we won't have a chance to get to all of them. But let's start first with one called light gazing. Here's a picture of a classroom, a typical preschool classroom. And if you can imagine a home, maybe a play area in a home with similar windows and a rug where a child could play with these bright windows and the light shining on the rug. If you were to lay a child with CVI who had a tendency to light gaze, which is more common in the children with more severe CVI, they would tend to, if they could scoot over to the lit spot of the carpet, they would do so. Otherwise, they might just turn their head and gaze out that window. And the bright light coming through there would be very, very attractive and very distracting. If you were trying to, say, read a book sitting in front of that window, the child might have a hard time looking at the book or even focusing on the book because they would be so attracted to that light. And so, of course, the strategy for this would be to either dim out the windows or turn the child so that their back is to the window and so that they would then have better focus on what you were trying to teach or interact with. Another way to use this characteristic is to use a light box, which is also available from that American Printing House website that's the definition was posted from. And those are available through quota funds for children registered with Virginia Department for Blind and Visual Impairments. So you can check with your ed coordinators on that. And this next slide is a demonstration of the attractiveness of an iPad with a simple visual display. That's an app, I believe, called Little Bear Sees. And that is an app designed for children with CVI, and they use very simple pictures that the child can interact with. And I'm in no way endorsing iPads or tablets for the children, but just showing you that the visual display is modified in such a way that it's a very simple image with a black background. Another characteristic is how the children process color. So some children with more severe to moderate CVI might have a color preference or might better process single color objects when compared to multicolor objects. So for instance, if you look at that top toy clock, that might be really attractive to some young children. A child with CVI might be overwhelmed by all those different colors and might just turn their head and look away or close their eyes and just interact with it through their hands. Whereas the other two pictures show single color objects that would be easier to visually process and engage with. So that's important to notice. Another strategy, if this turns out to be something that a young child is found to do better with just single color objects. Things like taking a bottle and putting their best color. So they might have a preference towards red or yellow or blue or green. It's usually highly saturated colors. And so you could take, say, a koozie that was a single color, like red koozie, and put it over their bottle, or a sock. We've used socks just to make something that might have been multicolor in the color that the child sees the best. And so that can help engage them with their toys, or select forks and bowls that are in the color that the child sees best. Here's a little girl sweeping, and they've used some blue tape to highlight a tile for her to sweep the little, it looks like little beans into. Okay, so here's an interactive one, so get your pointers ready. If you can go and, based on what we've talked about so far, just put a star, or you can use any marker that you like, on the item that you think would be easier for a child to visually process.
And so if you've forgotten where you find the little star, it's just on the vertical little small toolbar. It's the second one down. Just pick one of those tools. You can make it be a pointer or a star or the starburst. Oh, you guys are doing great.
Wow. Very good. So the very easiest one would be this red single button switch. The next easiest one would be, it looks like it's got a little bit of a scribble on it, and that one would be the second easiest one. Because there's extra colors in there, that might be a little harder for a child just learning to use their vision. And of course the hardest one would be this one with the little pictures on there. Usually two-dimensional pictures are harder for children to see, and we wouldn't expect to use that until they're visually functioning quite well in their environment. So that's important to remember when we're offering communication choices. We certainly don't want to make accessing communication any more difficult than it needs to be. So using things that are optimally accommodating for the child would be great. And sometimes we'll do things like use whole objects in combination with the voice output devices. Okay, so here's some more fun toys, and you can use your pointers again. Now this is a little tricky. There's actually two really good options on this one that we would start with for a child with cortical visual impairment that's just starting to use their vision, or that we're trying to elicit a visual response. Yeah, so remember, single color is easier than multicolor. And this is one of those differences for children with CVI. They'll typically respond better to the single color, like the bunny with the blue. And also, we didn't talk about today, but the gold foil pom-pom there would be very attractive. It also kind of simulates movement, and that would also catch the child's visual attention. So that's excellent. You guys did really good with that.
Julie, we've gotten a question about whether you could recommend a checklist of behaviors associated with vision impairment. So if we don't do that right now, if you could remind me to help think.
Okay, I think
put that on our list.
But there's quite a few. We could probably send out some resources for that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to talk also about visual latency. So what this means is there could be a time delay from the time something was presented. Say that little toy bunny was presented to the child, and they might be looking away or take a little while to look towards that toy that's presented. And so that time delay between the time it's presented and the time they actually focus on it is called visual latency. One thing I want to point out here is another tendency with children with CVI is to look away from the object when it's first presented. And they will do this for, up to, who knows, some children might do it for a minute and then come back to the object. The tendency of adults is to, when they look away like this little child is here, to then move the toy to where her eyes are now pointing, so it would be kind of down and to the right. However, the child isn't actually looking down and to the right. She's visually processing and thinking about what she just saw and getting ready to come back to where she saw it last. And so if it was presented to her and then moved to where her eyes moved to, and then she goes back to where it was, now she's kind of like lost again and looking for it. And then she's got to search it out and start the whole process over. And so I tell adults to think of this as when your mouse is spinning on your computer, whether it's an hourglass or a little colored wheel and it's spinning, it doesn't help to just keep clicking the mouse because the computer is trying to process. And you want to just let it process and then wait for it to be ready to focus on that image. So trying not to chase the vision around is really important. And that's one of those things that adults can help each other to do because it's such a strong urge to follow that eye gaze and it really slows down the visual processing. So visual field preference is another characteristic of CVI. So we talked about visual field loss in the very beginning and how children will naturally accommodate to use their best vision to see targets. And so here you see the little girl holding that to one side, to one eye, and probably using her very best visual fields. Another great time to notice where visual fields are strong is if you have a child in a high chair and you have, like, say their favorite Cheerios or something spread around the high chair table, and there might be a certain spot on that high chair that they just never seem to notice the Cheerios, and that might tell you that that's probably not their best visual field. Typically, the visual field that matures last or that they respond to last is directly below them, like the lower visual field. And so we have a little experiment to this, and that is to put your hand, and you might want to use your non-dominant hand, underneath your nose as seen in this picture, which is kind of held out flat to kind of give you a blocked visual field. And then if you have a computer in front of you or if you have a paper and pencil, you can try and type your name in the chat pod, adjusting your head as necessary to be able to see the computer keyboard. Or you can alternate instead, if you're not using a computer right now, you could just sign your name on a piece of paper. But notice how far you have to adjust your head to be able to see your finger typing on that keyboard. And so in that picture, I'll have my head very far adjusted, but if you might have to tilt it down. And so what happens, just notice that the children might be also accommodating for a visual field loss and tilting their head or holding their head in a position that works for them and helps them to process or get access to that information. Sometimes an adult might see a child bending their head over like that and prompt them to hold their head up or not sit like that or don't slouch in your chair. And so it's important to realize this. We might need to do something like raise up what we're showing them so that they don't have to bend their head at such an awkward position and adjust the visual presentation rather than asking the child to sit in an odd posture that's probably very uncomfortable anyways. The next characteristic is difficulty with visually guided reach and visual motor skills. So you see the little girl on the left is reaching for that slinky and looking at it at the same time, whereas the little girl on the right is reaching for Elmo but looking away as she does it. And so that's an example of looking and reaching as two separate events, which is typical as children are learning to use their vision. They might look and then turn their head away, which is very different from that AT&R reflex where children's arms and neck go in opposite directions. This is more of a look and then they look away and then they reach. So that shouldn't be confused with just basic reflexes. All right, so the next characteristic is just a difficulty with complexity. And you might kind of have noticed that a lot of what we've talked about so far kind of deals with the more simple the better. And so this is another example of that. So if I think we're going to use, for the moment, I'm just going to let you find it, and at the very end we'll have you use your pointers to do it. But if you can find the pterodactyl in this picture, pretty noticeable. I hope you can find that. This is a demonstration of a very simple presentation of a single color object on a black background, and that's about the easiest we can get. The only way to make this any easier would be for me to darken the room, make sure it's nice and quiet because noise can also make it harder to process, and then maybe shine a flashlight or a little pin light on that to illuminate it a little bit. Would be the optimal visual presentation. Now we're getting a little more complicated. I've got a distractor in there that's the same color. We've got a more complicated background and then another toy altogether. Hopefully you can still find that pterodactyl. Get a little more complicated. We still have more of visual color that's different. So the child would have to distinguish between the yellow in the middle and the yellow in the truck and the yellow shape of the pterodactyl. And now we're getting even more complicated with more yellow in the background and another toy that might have some similar characteristics. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you found the pterodactyl already. And again, your hand, you can find that hand to raise underneath your name in the participants box. Oh, good. You found it. All right. It's going to put my star on it. There it is. All right. So last one. This one should be a little bit harder. Go ahead and raise your hand when you can find this one. Oh, good job. Some of you are really good at this. And this one's a little tricky because it's really not the whole object in this picture. It's just a partial object. But that's just to remind us that how we present things, sometimes we show them, yep, someone's got a pointer on there. We might have different ways of presenting it, the orientation of it, and that can change the visual appearance of it and make it a little harder to find. So you can see it's kind of cut off over here on the right-hand side. All right. Now when it comes to complexity, one thing I wanted to point out also is that faces are very visually complex. And children with CVI tend, especially if it's very severe, tend to not look at faces, even from very early ages. And so this could often be confused with autism because it seems like they're not socially engaging because they're not visually making eye contact. Even sometimes with their parent, they might take a very long time before they're visually focusing on the parent's face. So this might differ from autism in that the research I was able to find from Sarah Jane Webb and her colleagues, and that was published in 2016, talks about children with autism might still have look at faces for the first year of life, where children with CVI tend to not look at faces if they have very severe CVI and at a young age, but then as they get older and better at using their vision, if their vision does improve, they might start looking at faces, especially familiar faces like their caretakers, their mother, as they mature. Also, it's important to point out another difference between CVI and that facial engagement or regard is that the children with CVI, they're likely to still develop joint attention, social smiling, and social engagement. It just might not be in response to seeing. They might not see the smile from their mother, but it doesn't mean that they're not socially engaging. They might do it in different ways. Things like pointing we won't do visually, but we might use a technique called hand under hand, which for children with visual impairments of all kinds, we prefer to use hand under hand, where the adult's hand is under the child's hand, and the child has the option to let go or to follow the adult's hand. And this is a way that we can do visual demonstrations through our hands. And there's a ton of information on hand under hand, and my email is on there. I'd be happy to talk your ear off that on a time that we have a little bit more flexible timing, and but that's a really strong strategy that's very helpful. Distance viewing is thought to be more challenging just because it's more visual clutter and there's more things in the way, and they have to visually pick out like that little tiny book in this whole scheme of the room and where to focus. So that might be more difficult. And so sometimes they don't see things from a distance, which then could relate to not following someone's point. So they might not be able to find a toy or see that someone's pointing to something far away, or even recognize that other friends or familiar adults are in the room if they can't hear them. The last characteristic is visual novelty. A lot of times with little children, we want to show them lots of different fun and exciting things to maintain their attention. However, with CVI, it's easier for them to visually process something that's known. You had a little taste of that with the picture of the dog. In the very beginning, once you knew what you were looking at and you were familiar with it, it was easier to find, hopefully, on that page. So here's a little experiment that you're going to do, and get ready to type in your chat pod. I'm going to show you 2 images. In between, I'm going to give you a chance to respond. And so I'm going to ask you to count how many beaks, how many bird beaks that you see in the picture. And hopefully this first slide will give you a little bit easier time than the second one, but I'm going to show you both of them for the same amount of time. All right, so I'm going to show you this slide for a couple minutes, and I want you, or I'm sorry, a few seconds. And then I will pull it down, and you can type in the chat pod how many beaks you see. You ready? Okay, so in your chat pod, go ahead and type in how many beaks you saw in that picture. All right. Great. Okay, so you all did very well. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 beaks in that picture. Okay, so let's get ready for the next one. Okay, how many beaks were in that picture? And my apologies to anyone who found that visually disturbing. As a friend and colleague. Now hopefully that last picture had more novelty to you, and those weren't animals that you frequently see in your yard or anywhere. Yes, you needed more time, Karen. Thank you. That's an excellent point. It takes longer to visually process something that's novel and that we weren't expecting. Okay, so I'm going to go back and let you see that picture again. Several of you got it. There is just one, and it's down here on this dog-like shape with a bird-like head. As you can see, there's other things that might have thrown you for expecting to see a bird and not. So this was like some kind of photo mashup Google Images search gone kind of sad. Either way, it's just an experience to show you that the novelty takes longer to process, to visually scan, and sometimes we can present things to children in a very fast way, and they don't really have a time to process what they're seeing and learn from it. Now, if you found that absolutely disturbing, here's a little visual cleanser from you of my sweet puppy, and then a picture of her as she's all grown up now. Okay, so hopefully you found that more pleasant. So diagnosing cortical visual impairment, as I mentioned earlier, is challenging in that there's not a specific medical test or eye examination that we can just say, okay, we're going to run this panel and we are going to know 100% for sure if the child has CVI or not. It's a diagnosis that's usually made when visual performance is poor but not explained from an eye examination. And I mentioned earlier that we consider observations, visual functioning, and also considering other disabilities the child might have, medical or health problems, episodes of not having oxygen during birthing process or later in life through a traumatic incident, hearing difficulties, and just realizing that other characteristics can make the diagnosis harder.
Julie, we did have a question earlier about what types of specialists diagnose and treat CVI, and so I guess I'm thinking about for early intervention folks who might be part of helping to look at this as part of what might be going on with the child.
So there are some eye doctors, some ophthalmologists that will diagnose it that have specialty in the area. I know there's some out towards the Stanton-Harrisonburg area. And that might be a good question if you're actually looking to identify a particular doctor. Talking with the folks at DBVI can help share information. Pediatric neurologists sometimes might make the diagnosis. Often it's several, it's kind of a collaborative effort where the eye doctor might notice some things, the pediatrician might note some health involvements that they're having. So it really depends on where you're located and who's available and who's trained.
Okay.
So it's kind of a tough question to answer.
Okay. And then we also did get a question from Shelby about, is this primarily diagnosed in children with other impairments? You mentioned CP, but is it more prevalent in other diagnoses as well?
It's more prevalent in children with other health conditions. There's actually a whole big list, but generally things that involve the brain.
Okay.
So considering that this is a problem in the brain, so it's more likely if the child has other
neurological things going on. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay.
Were there any other questions before I think we're going to go into?
I think I did just want to make sure you have mentioned a couple of times the resources through the Department for the Blind and Visually Impaired, DBVI in Virginia. So I just posed a question of whether people who are on the phone with us and participating in the webinar from Virginia are aware of your regional resources and access those folks through DBVI. And so if you're not aware of who that person is in your region, if you could post that to say no you're not and what part of the state you're from, we could help to get you connected with that person or persons in your area. Julie is very knowledgeable about those folks, and they are incredibly talented and knowledgeable. And I'm sure other people on the webinar could connect us as well.
And I think Karen Phipps, I thought I saw you on the so feel free to chime in there to answer those questions.
Excellent, Karen. Yes, please do. So we have a wealth of experience on the phone on the call as well. So please feel free to answer a question there. If you have information to share, we are all learning from one another. So please do that. Well, we're going to shift our gears just a little bit to sort of refine our conversation that, as you might well, do you mind clicking that for me? Thank you. That some of the characteristics of cortical vision impairment can easily be confused with red flags for autism or kids who may have autism. And Julie mentioned that book, the one that's by Roman and Lansky, the great book, a resource. And then she also has just brought out for us to look at together today, just to have in front of us for resources. It's just this amazing, wonderful book that she, I think, gave us the resource for. We will put together this list of a couple of resources for you to share, but this is called Vision and the Brain, Understanding Cerebral Visual Impairment in Children, which I think is relatively young, by Luke and Dutton. Is that how you say it? Luke and Dutton. Luke and Dutton, which is an incredibly well-researched and thorough resource that might be helpful for you to have available for questions. While I get started with this, Julie, maybe you can answer this question about what the age that CVI is typically diagnosed. So vision problems are very common in individuals with autism. If this is the case, visual problems will certainly interfere with the child's vision, learning, sports, and daily life. And many of the distinct visual symptoms occur for one of two reasons, either because people with autism use visual information inefficiently or due to the fact that they have hypersensitive vision and react by being visually defensive. So what causes the visual problems related to autism? And the visual symptoms of autism can be explained as poor integration between the separate but equally necessary visual processing pathways of focal and ambient information flow. So what we thought might be helpful would be to try to think about different characteristics related, because this, of course, just like Julie said, really just, this is just that the majority of our time is spent really thinking about kids with cortical vision impairment, but we did want to think about how this might relate to kids with autism. What might be some of those characteristics, and how could we kind of parse this out a little bit so that we had a better sense of what might be considered some things that would be happening with a particular child. So if we had this particular situation for this child, for instance, so does this child have autism spectrum disorder or a cortical vision impairment? And we would be thinking about the characteristics related to visual patterns, for instance. So if we had these particular 4 examples of a child, Joey, who compulsively gazes at lights, or Myra, who easily becomes overstimulated, and when she does, she has short attention span, or Thunder, who consistently wiggles his fingers in front of his eyes, or Tamika, who rarely looks directly at an object, but typically uses her peripheral vision. So you could either, what we're really thinking about is that we're trying to think about which of these children presents more with characteristics that are more like a child who has autism as compared to a child who has cortical vision impairment. So if you could go ahead and just put your answer in the chat box, or you could use the letters. You can either just put the numbers, the letters using using our survey things, or we can just put our answers in the chat box. I think is probably our easiest one. So yes, it looks like several people are answering that C probably is, or more typically, an example of a child who may have a more of a characteristic of autism as compared to autism and cortical vision impairment or cortical vision impairment. And again, the only reason for having us have this conversation now is just to think about, and someone brought that conversation up just a minute ago about how does this play out with children who have cortical vision impairment plus other diagnoses and other characteristics of other developmental needs. So, and I guess Julie actually, when we talked this morning, even said that really even this example of thinking of a child who wiggles their fingers in front of their eyes, that if you remember, we talked about children who have cortical vision impairment that were this child in a room with really big windows and lots of light coming in, that in fact the child might be, a child with cortical vision impairment might actually be exploring the use of light and wiggling their fingers because that was a use of their vision. So, but in a different context, in a kind of a classic definition of a child who may present with autism, that was the characteristic that we were kind of paying attention to related to visual patterns. So let's kind of think of another, just a real quick example. So let's think about how this might play out then with a child with characteristics related to social and communication skills. So think about a child who does not interact with his peers at child care. That's Jake. Or Katrina has not been able to learn categories. She is still trying to learn different types of animals. Or Shira, who can repeat phrases from movies over and over and over again. So which of those do we think is more typical of a child who has autism as compared to a child with cortical vision impairment or a child with cortical vision impairment and autism? Yes, so C, exactly. So again, the kind of item that we would pay attention to, and that would be more related to social and communication of the phrases from movies over and over again. And I think to think about what Julie talked about just a few minutes ago about her her question about, sorry, oh that's okay, thank you, about the fact about eye contact and interaction, that often children with cortical vision impairment still very much have interaction style things that may in fact appear to be kind of typical for a child who has autism, but in fact they're not. They are just because they don't maintain eye contact. And so, but they have that interaction in very different ways, but it has more to do with their vision. So, all right, so here's our last one. Characteristics related to motor planning and sensory stimuli. So Jasmine has a difficult time navigating a cluttered room. She will often bump into things or step on objects. Gwendolyn does not like soft food textures and only eats crunchy foods. Raphael does not like to be in crowds. He gets very upset. Or Wendell is working on skills needed to eat lunch. He prefers to grab his food with his fist and has difficulty using a fork. So in thinking about these 4 different scenarios, where do we see something that feels more like or maybe better describes a child who has autism as compared to a child who may have cortical vision impairment, or both autism and cortical vision impairment? And we're really thinking about motor planning and sensory. Yes, exactly. Lots of folks have marked that they think B better reflects that. Perfect. So again, these are just, we tried to think of some ways to make this real and just have some examples, but I think the conversation that folks have been having in chat about how there are lots of ways that these that the needs of individual children are, of course, what's most important, and how their needs are represented in the opportunities that they present all during the course of their day is the most important thing, regardless of their diagnosis. Okay, so we just wanted to make sure that everybody, though, knew about the red flags of autism that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have published. These are the kind of red flags to kind of pay attention to that we all have in our minds for potential diagnosis of autism. So please keep these present in your radar and on your radar. We've presented the site for you there, so you have those. And please, those of you who work with me know that I love the Learn the Signs and Act Early materials from the Learn the Signs Act Early campaign from the Centers for Disease Control. If you want to talk with me about those, this is again Dina, please let me know. I would love to share those with you. One thing we also did just want to put on the radar for folks is a tool called the MChat. If you are using the MChat now to do developmental screenings for autism in your locality, can you raise your hand? I'm really curious how many of you are currently using the MChat as part of what happens in your local system. If you're currently using, or even if you're thinking about using it, if you could go ahead and raise your hand, I would love to know that. So these are some common questions. The MChat is a tool that was designed to be used at 24 and 30 months with, well, a variety of different points, between 16 and 30 months for children, and it's done to be used with the family, but it has different questions that are asked. These are some of the questions that have to do, that we thought would be particularly relevant to pay attention related to vision that may overlap with cortical vision impairment. So if does your child smile at you? Do they smile back at you? Does your child look you in the eye? Does your child look when something happens? Okay. And then here are some characteristics that may not be observed in children with CVI. Have you ever wondered if your child might be deaf? Does your child make unusual finger movements near his or her eyes? So these are ASD and not CVI characteristics. And you see there are very few. So these are the ones that may need further interpretation, that may lead to a determination if the child has CVI or if the child may need an ASD evaluation. So as the people who are involved in early intervention and the people who are talking with families, particularly very early in the process, certainly your role is to help to get them connected with their physicians and primary medical practices to figure out what next steps need to be taken in terms of diagnostic protocols. But I guess I'm just encouraging you to keep your radar up and these questions as you talk with families as to what might be going on developmentally and neurologically with the children that you come in contact with. These are some of the MCHAT items that really you may want to keep on your radar. Then in the interview, for instance, when it asks, is Emma interested in other children, think about these follow-up questions. That's how the MCHAT works, is it has those follow-up questions built in. Those are particularly relevant when you're trying to think about sorting this out, and again, how to best support this particular child from an intervention point of view and support them in the context of their families and meet the priorities that their family has as of interest to them. Do you want to see if there's any question on your part? Well, I was just looking at, so trying to glance over and see if there were questions. It looks like several people said that folks in early intervention are using the MCHAT, which I'm tickled to see. I was just trying to glance really quick over here and see if any particular additional questions have come in since we were talking. It looks like pediatricians are using the MCHAT. I love that someone asked a question about if there are going to be trainings on using the MCHAT, because we actually are organizing those, Goochland Powhatan, through a project here at the Partnership for People with Disabilities, so I'll let you know about that and let you know how to get involved in that. So thank you for asking about that. We're just quickly scanning these to make sure we didn't miss anybody's questions.
So there is a question about correlations between CVI and language delay or impairment. I think I would actually have to look up to see if there's something specific to CVI. With that, as I mentioned before, a lot of the children diagnosed with CVI, not all, but many of them, do have other medical conditions as well that might also contribute to language delay. So I think I would have to look deeper at the research to see if there's a specific tie or a study that looked at just CVI and language delay. However, what's important to remember is that if we're using visually based strategies to promote communication in a child and we don't have a good idea of how to best use their functional vision, then that could definitely harm the progress, because they're not accessing everything that they're being presented with and how they're the options they have to communicate. So that, and also just recognizing the different behaviors of a child who might communicate, say, if they don't see that their mother walks in the room, they may quiet instead of getting excited. They might quiet because they're listening for her rather than looking for her. And so just different behaviors like that, and making sure that the parents can interpret those behaviors in a way that helps them respond to the child and foster more interaction. So Karen asked, does it improve as the child develops and as they get older? It can. There's actually some research on this, and what they find is when strategies are put in place so that the child does have more opportunities to use their vision. So for instance, in this picture right here, if the child was sitting in that back corner there with all those toys behind them, we might recommend, if the child was just learning to use their vision, that we cover that shelf with like a black sheet or something to kind of block out the visual clutter so that there's not so much distraction for the child to just focus on one toy at a time. So some simple things like that. We might, adjust the lighting in the room to better engage their vision, making sure they're in a physically comfortable position and supported so that they can use their hands. Different things. There's lots of different strategies, and Dina and I were talking earlier about maybe we need to have a strategy presentation on CVI if this is an area of interest to many people, because it definitely helps to have the strategies as early as possible to improve.
Well, excellent. Well, we really appreciate all of you joining us today. We will put together a resource list based on several of the items that you asked for, and so we'll get that out to you as a follow-up to today's webinar. We also will be putting together, and we'll probably put them in the same, some of the similar resources in the update that goes out this month from the Integrated Training Collaborative, because the topic it corresponds with today's topic. So please look for that. We will be taking a hiatus from our talks on Tuesdays for the summer, so we will not be doing them in July and August, and so we will be back in the fall. So as we wrap up, Julie has shown us some of the resources that we've put together already for this topic for CVI, and we will continue to put a few more things together based on today's questions that you asked, and we'll get those out to you. But we really appreciate your time and your interest in this topic, and please be in touch if we can give you any additional information. Thanks, and have a great rest of your Tuesday. Bye-bye.
Bye.